Hi guys, so today I'm going to show you how I paint Hero Forge miniatures. I've got this lovely little miniature which is an elf wizard called Charles. I'm going to show you how I paint that. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and comment in the box below, and also don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell icon, and then you'll know when new videos are coming up. Okay, so I'm set up and ready to go. First thing I'm going to do is put the base coats on. So I'm going to use a Army Painter standard brush, and I've got a little bit of water in a Ready Mills tub here. So I'm just going to put a little bit of water on that, and I'm going to squeeze a little bit of Barbarian flesh. I always start this Army Painter Barbarian flesh. I always start doing the skin tones first, because usually getting into sort of around the neck and everything, if you do it afterwards, it tends to get onto the other areas that you painted. But if you do it this way round, you can just paint over those bits where you've kind of overrun a little bit. So I'm going to do that first. A little squeeze of Army Painter Barbarian flesh into the tub. And again, it's worth just having a look and seeing how thick the paint is. I always prefer to go a bit thinner, because I always feel like you can put another coat on if you need to, rather than too thick, because if you go too thick you can obscure all of the detail, and these are such lovely detailed miniatures, it would be a real shame to do that. So I'm going to go ahead now and put on all the Barbarian flesh, and I will be back when I've finished doing that. Just another point as well is, at this stage I'm not going to worry too much about being really neat, because I know I'm going to go back in and correct it later on. Okay, so the next stage, I want to paint the robes of my elf wizard in a sort of Slytherin type theme, because the player is a bit of a Slytherin fan. If you watch some of the other videos, you might see some Slytherin posters in the background. So I'm going to go for green skin, Army Painter green skin, for the main parts. And what I forgot to say was that as many of the paints as I can, I'm going to be using from the Army Painter basic paint set. Kind of as a proof really that you don't need an awful lot to do lots of things with it. And the other thing I forgot to say was that Army Painter, Hero Forge, when they send the miniatures out, they are already primed, ready to go, so you can just paint straight on. Okay, so I'm going to put a little bit of this in my palette, a little squeeze in there, and then again, not being too careful with it at the moment, I'm just going to go and mix a little bit of water in with that paint and apply that to the areas of the robe that I want to be green. So once that's all done, I'll be back. Okay, so the next stage is to paint the leather areas and the wooden areas brown. I forgot to say I painted the leaves on the base in the green as well. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze a little bit of Army Painter leather brown into my palette, and again mix with a little water just to make the paint flow. Using my standard brush. So I'm going to do the staff and the bow, the quiver of arrows. There's a little rope belt around Charles's waist, so I'll do that as well. His boots are in a leather. Also the spell book, I'm going to do that in brown as well. So I'll be back when that's done. Okay, so I'm going to paint the white areas now, the wreath of flowers around the hair and the feathers on the arrows. So I'm going to use Army Painter matte white, squeeze a little bit in my palette, and again I'm going to mix a little bit of water with this just to make sure it flows. Now I'm going to use my standard paintbrush to apply that to those areas. So once that's done, I'll be back for the next base coat. Okay, the next stage is to paint all of the black areas Army Painter matte black. So again, put a little squeeze in my palette, mix with water to water it down a bit, and I'm going to do Charles's hair in the black. Don't think there's any other black areas. There might be when I get the small detail brush out, there might be a few buckles and things, but for the moment I'm just going to do the hair black. So mix a little bit of water, water this down a little bit, and I'm just going to apply that to all of the hair, being fairly careful to not get it onto the flower garland. But something else I noticed when I painted the flower garland was that actually Charles's ears are sticking out there as well, so I'm going to need to go back in those areas and paint those in the Barbarian flash. So I'll be back when this is done. Okay, so now that's done, I'm going to go back in and I want to paint the fireball in an orange, but I don't have an orange, so what I'm going to try and do is mix Army Painter Pure Red and Army Painter Demonic Yellow. So I'm going to need more yellow than red to get that sort of fiery colour, so I'm going to put a little squeeze of red in the palette, but not too much, and quite a lot of yellow. And I'm going to add the red to the yellow. That way I'll be able to control the tone. So again, I'm going to add a bit of water and just a dot of red, and we'll see how we go. So I think I'm going to need a little bit more. So I'm just going to keep on cleaning the brush each time, and then that way I can keep my red colour the right shade, and I can get my orange the right colour as well. So that's starting to turn a bit orange now. Maybe a little bit more. So it's still a bit yellow, so we'll try just a tad more. And hopefully this should be enough now. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that orange colour now, and I'm going to apply that to the fireball. Now what I'm hoping is that when I put a wash on this, that will add a bit of shadow, and then I can dry brush it later. So I'll be back when that's all gone on. Okay, so I'm going to go in now and I'm going to paint all of the bits where I've messed up. I'm going to use Army Painter Uniform Grey for the bits that were primed before, and I'm going to use a small detail brush just to use that for all the fine areas, bits where I've made mistakes. So I will be back when I've done all of that. Okay, so now I've tidied the miniature up, I'm going to use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is really runny. So I'm going to put it in my palette. I won't really need to add any water to this. And then I'm going to use a standard brush to paint in all of the areas to wash over. So what it will do is it will run into the recesses. I don't really need to do it over the black areas, but if any of the other areas, just run that over. If it starts to pool too much, I can just either get a bit of tissue and take it out, or I can put the brush over it again and just reduce it down. So you can see it's starting to pool around the face there, and that will just help to make some shadows, which again we're going to highlight later on. Okay, so now I've put the wash on, I'm going to go in with all the base colours again and just pick out the raised areas, so the folds on the material, the bridge of the nose, cheeks. I'm going to leave some of the areas dark where there's shadow, and then that will help to kind of create those light areas as well. So I'm just going to start with the flesh again. You can use a standard brush for this, and then maybe the next stage when we add the tints, probably use the small detail brush for that. So I'm just going to get in there and just paint in those raised areas. Okay, and then I'll finish the rest when that's done. Okay, so I'm going to use a method called dry brushing for the flower garland and the leaves on the base. So to do that, I'm going to pick the base colour for each of those. So for the flower garland I'm going to use matte white, and for the leaves I'll use green skin, both Army Painter paints. Put a little dab in my palette, and I'm not going to add any water this time. For these areas, because they're quite small, I'm going to use a small brush. If it was a larger area I'd use a dry brush like this one, but because they're small areas I'm going to use my standard brush. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of tissue paper down here, and I'm going to dab my brush into the paint that I want to dry brush, and I'm going to take off as much of that paint as I can so that I can only just see it, and then I'm going to drag that across where I want to dry brush to just highlight those areas, the raised areas. So once that's done, I will be back and then we'll look at doing some tinting. Okay, so now the highlights are on the miniature, I'm going to go in, and for each of the base colours I'm going to mix a tint. So to do that I'm going to take the base colour, I'm going to start with Barbarian Flesh, and I'm going to mix a tiny little bit of white in just to make the tint a little bit brighter, and I'm going to apply that to all of the really the highest areas. So around the face, that would be kind of the tip of the nose, and the lips and the eyebrow, cheeks. I'm going to be looking at the knuckles on the fingers, and I'll do that to all the other areas as well. So I'm going to use a fine detail brush, small detail brush for this one, and I'm going to mix a little bit of water in and just make that tint. So it's a little bit lighter than the previous, and then just apply that to those areas I just mentioned. So tip of the nose, I might do a little bit on the cheeks, and it just makes those highlights pop a little bit more. Okay, so when I've got areas, I can also use a bit of a dry brush technique on this. for some of the areas where it's really fine. So these lips, because they're quite pronounced, I'm going to dry brush that just so that it picks out those areas. So I will be back when the rest of those are done. Okay, so I've put the tints on the miniature now, and the next stage is to do the little bits of detail. So to start with, I'm going to paint the eyeballs black, and then I'll paint whites over those, and then a little dot of black to make the pupil. I'm also, whilst I'm waiting for those bits to dry, going to paint the base in a brown colour. So I'm going to start off with the black, so Army Painter matte black for that, then matte white, and then back to the black, and then I'm going to do leather brown for the base. So a little dab of this in the palette, and for these bits I'm going to use a small detail brush, just water it down a touch, and really carefully I'm just going to paint in where the eye is. And do the same on the other side. So I'll be back when that's finished. Okay, so finished painting the detail on the miniature, and the last stage now is to give it a coat of anti-shine varnish. This is Army Painter. I've been shaking this for 1.5 minutes. So I'm going to apply a coat now, and then I'll apply one more coat, and then the miniature will be ready. So it's important with spraying varnish to make sure that you stay fairly far away, because if you get too close you're going to obscure some of that wonderful detail. So I've got it on an off cut so I can turn it around and do the different angles. And this will help to protect the model, so if it falls off the table it's not going to get too damaged.